Well, hello again, everybody. I'm Michael Tomasky, editor of The New Republic, and this is the new edition of Tomaskycast. And I am joined, as you can see, by Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker, and Lynn Novick, also the documentary filmmaker, and Ken's partner with one other person. Isn't there one other producer on this?
Yes, Sarah Botstein is director and producer with us. Yes.
Yes. And the new project, as you can see there on Lynn's wall, is called The U.S. and the Holocaust. And it premieres this coming Sunday, September 18th on PBS. So look for it there and stream it. I guess people can stream it wherever they do such things. Hi to you both, and welcome, and thanks a million for coming.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you again.
Thanks so much.
Likewise. Yeah, likewise. So let's start. Lynn, why don't you start? The obvious first question is, why this topic?
Yes, well, first to say that we've been asked this a lot, and why is this an important story to tell now? And we believe it is, but this project started for us quite a long time ago. As we've been saying, we have worked on projects having to do with the Second World War, and Ken and Jeffrey C. Ward made a beautiful series on the Roosevelts, and questions about America's response to the Holocaust were certainly part of those stories, and we were interested in that theme. And then in 2015, the Holocaust Museum in Washington approached us. They were planning an exhibition and a whole initiative around the question of Americans and the Holocaust. And that was a multi-year project for them. And they asked if we would be interested in collaborating with them in some ways to create a documentary film exploring the same questions. They got their exhibition up in 2018. And that's when we really dove full time into this project. So we incubated for quite a while. We thought about it. We figured out who the scholars were and which witnesses to interview. And then we really got fully up to our elbows 4 or 5 years ago. And the film is finally coming out now.
Ken, aside from the fact that you were approached by the Holocaust Museum, what intellectually drove you to this subject?
Yeah, I think it's the fact that Americans have, for most of the time since the period of the Holocaust, sort of had a kind of deniability about it. Just that, we're separated by an ocean and a continent. We didn't know what was going on. And we knew that we did know what was going on. And in fact, the subsequent years of research on this project suggest that there were as many as 3,000 articles in 1933 alone about Hitler's plans and the beginning of the mistreatment of Jews there under his brand new regime. And then I think there's the fundamental question is, of course, what we did and what we didn't do, and perhaps what we should have done. And so for us, in order to approach it, we needed to go back and sort of unwind the film and go back to a period when we had more or less open borders, 1870 to 1920, millions of people come in that excite and create a backlash against particularly Jews, but also others, that is given a kind of a new voice with eugenics, which the pseudoscience that suggests that there could be a hierarchy of races or nationalities or ethnicities, when of course that's complete bunk. It's subscribed to by lots of very prominent people, from TR to Helen Keller. Madison Grant writes a book called The Passing of the Great Race, which excites this sense that the dominant white Protestant majority of Americans is going to be replaced, outbred and outnumbered by these new immigrants. And there's a great fear that whatever is American will be lost. And so after the First World War, there's a Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that severely restricts immigration. It sets quotas for the first time from countries, and it favors those countries that eugenics favored, the northern Nordic nations, and minuscule quotas for those southern and central and eastern Europeans, nations that had, of course, many, many Jews who had been coming and fleeing not just economic dislocation, but pogroms and other discrimination. So if you add to that our mistreatment of Native Americans and their isolation into reservations, something Hitler admired greatly, saw it as part of our virility as a country. And he also thought that the Johnson-Reed Act was fantastic. You add to that, our own experience of slavery and racism that was endemic in American society, white supremacy. And then, of course, anti-Semitism, which is, just everywhere in the world. And you add to that the sort of final straw that breaks the camel's back of the Depression. You've got all sorts of reasons why Americans can excuse themselves from doing anything that would in any way relate to what we advertise ourselves about: a nation of immigrant, welcoming of other people, having the values of the Judeo-Christian traditions that talk about taking care of other people. And so we spend many years during the 1930s and into the 40s avoiding dealing with bringing in refugees. Now, we have to say the United States brought in 225,000 refugees during this period. That is more than any other sovereign nation. But even if we had fulfilled the quotas, the minuscule quotas that we had been allowed, we could have invited in more than 5 times that number. And so this is an abject failure on our part that is rooted in these fundamental things of anti-Semitism, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiments, racism, whatever you want to call it. And it needed to be examined. And by saying the US and the Holocaust, we then realized that we actually had to then describe or redescribe in our professional experiences what the Holocaust was. And it sent us on a new mission that actually we learned much more than we thought we were going to about what actually took place, not just the gas chambers in the killing centers of Nazi-occupied Poland, not just the concentration camps, but the Shoah by bullets and all of the tick-tock, the minutia of that. And in the midst of it, I think it's important to say some of the bright stories, the individuals that risked everything to save other human beings, the organizations that don't ever get enough credit, what we'd call NGOs now, like the Hebrew Aid Immigrant Society that did so many things. So this is just somebody said to us last night that it was like 5 films in one, and there's lots of stuff going on. There's lots of nuance. There's lots of complication. It's really important not to paint stuff with broad strokes, except, of course, the evil of the Holocaust. And so we tried to find that nuanced approach. And it took many years to do it.
Yeah, I want to get to some of the positive stories. We'll get to that a little later. But I'd like you to talk, Lynn, a little bit about America in the 1930s with regards to these issues. I know this history, I think I know it pretty well, but I was floored by the overall impact of the first 2 episodes in particular. They described what was pretty bluntly, an ugly country with regards to racism and anti-Semitism in particular. You want to talk about that, Lynn?
Yes, I mean, there's really no getting around that, and it's just, as Ken was saying, it is complicated because after this huge waves of immigrants that came here, some of whom are my forebears, and many people probably watching this have ancestors who came here in that great wave from 1870 to 1920, that changed the country for the better, we would say. But there was a huge backlash against it. So the greater the population of Jews were in America, the more their overt anti-Semitism started to really bubble up and gain traction. And so, that's when you start to have quotas and restrictions and, rules, because before that, they weren't really necessary if you wanted to keep certain places the way they were. And you see a kind of mainstreaming of overt bigotry that was there before, but really sort of became center stage. At the same time, there's the Depression and, the kind of anxiety and just havoc being wreaked in the society with the near collapse of the economic system here. And the question of, what's going to happen, who's going to take care of us, and whether capitalism itself, democracy, will survive. That's where fascism sort of really starts to bubble up overseas, as we saw with the rise of Hitler, a lot of fascist sympathizers in Western Europe and here. And that was one of the things that was most troubling to us, to really come face to face with that. There was an organization called the German American Bund. Okay, I'd heard of them, but I didn't really understand the degree to which they were overtly speaking about a sort of a Nazi way of thinking about the world, calling for a Gentile-ruled, white, Christian United States, free of Jewish, Bolshevik, Moscow-directed domination. That's a speech that one of the leaders of this organization gave to a huge crowd in Madison Square Garden. So in New York, the pluralistic, inclusive place of America, 25,000 German American Nazis are gathering, saluting, Heil Hitlering. I mean, that's part of America too. And the
With a
Bonehead
huge
rallies
poster of
around
George Washington.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
It was on his
So
birthday.
Yeah.
on his birthday. So, there was a reaction to it. There were people standing up against it. There were people protesting in the streets against Hitler. So we don't want to paint, like Ken was saying, too broad a brush. But
Right.
don't forget, or we should not forget, this is also Jim Crow still exists. Lynching is still happening. Violence, mob violence, just taking away people's citizenship rights in our own country is part of who we are too. And so we probably shouldn't be surprised that hatred and bigotry are part of not the conversation, part of the society at a time when there's so much anxiety and insecurity and fear. And it's really fear mongering and people exploiting that fear that people have to, scapegoat certain people and sort of take your eye off the ball of where the problems really are coming from. And I think that's a lot of what was going on.
Let's talk about that a little more, Ken. As we get into Hitler's reign from January of 1933 onward, there were early warnings, as the documentary shows. But it was really, my impression from watching it was that Kristallnacht really kind of broke through. It was 1935 was the night of broken glass, was the first
38, 1938.
38,
November of 1938.
Yeah, 38. The Long Knives was 35. That was a totally different thing. Sorry. But that was the first event that really broke through in the American media and brought some people out to say, we must do something. And yet, even at that point, American public opinion firmly against.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, this is part of the thing that's so heartbreaking about this story from our point of view. And I don't mean the filmmaker's point of view, but I think from the American point of view, is that even when American sympathy is with the victims of Kristallnacht, they still believe in overwhelming numbers that the Jews have probably brought it upon themselves, and that when questioned about whether they want to bring in anybody else right now or increase the quotas, essentially relax the onerous terms of the Johnson-Reed Act, they're saying, 85% of Protestants, 84% of Catholics, and 25% of American Jews are saying, close the doors, close the golden door of Emma Lazarus' poem. And that, is incredibly disheartening because, of course, Kristallnacht is really one of the main tipping points where, if the first act for the Nazis is the installation of Adolf Hitler as chancellor in January of 33, the end of that first act has got to be Kristallnacht, right? And now we're going into a different gear. Things are going to be changing. They've hoped to drive the Jews from the 560,000 or so German Jews and then the 190,000 Austrian Jews they'll inherit in the Anschluss, and make life and Jews are getting out. But they want their Lebensraum, they want their breathing room. They're going to consider the East like our Wild West, populated by people who have no kind of citizen value, no sense of statehood or propriety over the land. And so Hitler greatly admired our subjugation of the native populations, and that's what he wanted to do to the Slavic people and to the millions of Jews. So next door in Poland is not 560,000 Jews, but 3.3 million. And then you have to think about Latvia and Lithuania and Belarus and Ukraine, and all of a sudden, not even to mention southern, Romania and Hungary, and you're talking about the expansion into so many different countries that it becomes clear that the only thing you can do after dismissing fanciful things like when Britain falls, we'll take their great navy and we'll ship all the Jews to Madagascar where they'll die of hunger, right?
Wow.
Then somebody says, you know what? We will kill them now, all of them.
Yeah.
And then, for the first 2 million is what we call a Shoah by bullets. And that's before anybody's saying, hey, I have an idea. It's less messy, let's gas them. And that takes place. We have to be very careful. You know, there are concentration camps, lots of them in Germany. And then there are killing centers, specifically designed killing centers to gas human beings and to kill them in Nazi-occupied Poland. And there's Auschwitz and the Treblinka and the Belzec and the Sobibor and the Chelmno. And so you've got these horrific places, only one of which actually survives, and only part of it, and that's Auschwitz. For the evidence, because the Germans were retreating and trying to destroy all that. So, you know, this is just, you know, Americans can't get their heads around it, even when they are embracing the fact that the Germans actually might be killing Jews. And that's not a good thing to Americans, you know. They still think it can't possibly be 1 million or 2 million when it's actually already by that time 4 million. And the strange, sad thing about our reluctance to get refugees out when we could get them out is that by the time we've got a boot on the ground, 3/4 of the Jews of Europe who will be killed have been killed. And before, and it's even a lot more percentage by the time we've got an air base in which we might, in the hypothetical idea that many people had that helped prompt us make this film, that you could bomb the rail lines of Auschwitz. Happy to talk about the complexity and the nuances of that. But that took an air base in Foggia where you could conceivably, on a tank of gas, get up to Auschwitz and back and do what?
That was really interesting. That was something I admit I hadn't really considered. Could we have bombed Auschwitz and Treblinka and the others? And it's a very morally complicated question that you know that the film addresses with all the proper nuance. But Lynn, circle back to that, but also give people watching this a primer on Roosevelt. I think everybody knows that, you know, he didn't do nearly as much as he could have. He did a few things here and there in the early days. But talk about how evidence was brought to him. By what time, by what year did he know, or should have known unequivocally, that something really nightmarish was going on? And of course, he had, you know, a Congress that didn't want to lift a finger. He had Charles Lindbergh giving crazy speeches. But you know, what did Roosevelt do and not do, and at what pace?
This is a really, really important question. And, you know, we've tried very hard in the film to provide the context for that so that we really can try to put ourselves in his shoes or sitting at his desk and thinking about all the things he's considering with an isolationist, anti-Semitic country that doesn't want to get involved. And the polling is consistent, as Ken was saying, not to let people in, and certainly not to go over to Europe and rescue Jews in a military way. So, you know, the war was never framed that way when we got involved in it. And before the war, you know, the State Department was one of the sort of old-fashioned establishment institutions of Washington, peopled by the sort of elite who probably also to some degree were anti-Semitic as well, and certainly not disposed to welcome refugees or immigrants.
Yeah, that was really interesting too. The State Department is considered a bunch of crazy liberals today, but boy.
Yeah, not then. No, and Roosevelt brought in, you know, the New Deal did bring in a breath of fresh air into a lot of parts of Washington in terms of domestic policy, but in terms of foreign policy, that wasn't the priority. The priority was to save the country in the depth of the Depression. That wasn't job one for him. And, you know, that's got to be how he had to think about what he had to do. And so on top of that, you know, he's getting mixed messages from the Jewish community. Some people are coming to him and saying, you have to do something. And when we say the something, we're talking about before the war starts, relaxing the immigration quotas, letting in refugees, trying to massage around these Johnson-Reed Act rules, you know, but there's other people saying, don't do anything because that might make it harder for the Jews in Germany. And you have an anti-Semitic, overtly anti-Semitic propaganda against Roosevelt, where he's being called, you know, Frank D. Rosenfeld and the Jew deal. So, you know, it's just very complicated to think about how he has to navigate, and what he's really trying to do, and the scholar Peter Hayes explains this so beautifully in the film for us, prepare the country for the war he knows is coming. He can see the writing on the wall. He understands Hitler pretty well. He's read Mein Kampf in the original German, which I find astonishing.
Wow.
And he appreciates what we're dealing with. So he has to navigate an isolationist country, Congress dominated by white Southern Democrats who are also isolationist, and public opinion, and get the country ready to, for example, repeal the Neutrality Act, which would prevent us from helping the countries of Europe that are going to have to defend themselves against Hitler. So that's got to be the highest priority. And the refugee crisis is not the highest priority. And if he had focused on that, he might have alienated enough people that he couldn't have gotten the Neutrality Acts repealed. So the complicated calculus of what he's trying to juggle. Now, on the other hand, I think we can also say, as sort of moral leadership on this issue, he does speak out occasionally when reports come out after Kristallnacht, and then there's, over time, more and more news coverage of what the Nazis are doing. By the late of 1942, after the Shoah by Bullets is well underway, there's a report that finally comes out, and he makes a statement, he joins the declaration. So he does make statements here and there. He's not utterly silent, but he's not leading the charge to save the Jews of Europe. That's that. And if he had, the country would not have been following him. He says that at one point, if he was leading the charge, he would have looked behind and there would have been nobody there. So he has a different job, which is to bring the country along into a footing where we're prepared to fight the fight that needs to happen.
There are times when he feels cold and unsympathetic, and there are times when that kind of incredibly complex calculus that Lynn has so expertly described seems really, really clear. And that's okay. The thing, as I said before, is that you don't want to paint it with a broad brush. After we made our film on the war and the Roosevelts, people would come up to us and just say, oh, Roosevelt was an anti-Semite. Well, he appointed more Jews to his administration than anyone else.
Right.
He grew up in New York politics, so that wasn't an option. And I think Lynn said there's a key that I feel really strongly about, is that he did read Mein Kampf. And I think he understood who Hitler was. Yeah. And as he reported later to leaders that would come to him appealing to do things, and he wasn't a Führer, he wasn't a king, he didn't have the ability to wave a wand and have the Johnson-Reed Act disappear. And as Lynn suggests, had he tried anything like that, even from a bully pulpit, it might have undermined so many of the other things that are absolutely essential for why that war ended, right? Yeah. I think he referred to him as psychopathic. It meant that there's a whole nother set of rules that not only is he operating by, but we have to deal with it so that he becomes, I think, convinced that the only thing you can do is beat them on the battlefield. And that does not keep us from being extremely disappointed that he wasn't a more vocal spokesman for bringing in refugees, for looking for ways to get around the law to do that. But I think it's a big mistake to sort of tar him with the broad brush in a way to kind of, in some utterly human way, to equalize the evil and the brutality on the other side with some gigantic failing. I mean, this was Hitler's tactic, right? Yeah. The reason why we lost the First World War is because the Jews, they undermined us from within. There had to be a reason that the great German nation do it. And I'm afraid that in some ways that same kind of illogical thinking is operating, that now in retrospect, there's got to be some reason why Americans didn't do this, and it must begin at the top, right? But it doesn't examine the specifics of anti-Semitism within the State Department and pockets of the State Department, particularly the Assistant Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long. It doesn't deal with, as Lynn said, that Congress, which is uniformly opposed, and more important, the American people. This is the U.S. and the Holocaust, but it can be us and the Holocaust. And I think that if we want to blame Frank D. Rosenfeld for all of this failure, we're really blaming ourselves. Yeah. And blame is really beside the point. This is not a film that's about chiding people. This is saying, we got to look at ourselves just, clear-eyed and call balls and strikes. Yeah. We struck out here. We didn't have a good at bat here.
And we also, I think it's important to point out, we did take in more refugees than any other sovereign nation. Yeah. So it's not, and there's, conferences where nations of the world get together, and one of them in Evian, France, after the Anschluss, where Austria subsumed into Germany. And basically they stand around for a week and say, this is a terrible crisis. All these Jewish refugees, we don't want them. And they use all kinds of different excuses, but it's not like there's, let's say we're not an outlier in the way that basically the Jews of Europe who were facing mortal peril had nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And the UK as well. I mean, so there's blame to go around, but our focus is on America for the story that we're telling.
I have so many questions, but I don't want to take too much more of your time, but maybe another 10 minutes or so if you can. Let's talk about a couple of the unsung or undersung heroes of the story. Gerhard Rigner is a man who had was very central figure in getting information to Roosevelt and the United States government about what was happening. And then more fascinating even to me, I didn't write his name down, but John Paley.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a real hero. Talk about those two.
Yeah. So Gerhard Rigner is a German businessman who sneaks often over the border into Switzerland. And
sorry, Ken. Sorry, Gerhard Rigner is.
No, I'm sorry. Schulte
You're talking
is
about Schulte. Yeah,
Schulte is
sorry
a German business. He receives information from a German businessman named Schulte that essentially what we call what the Germans called the final solution was being implemented. And Rigner takes this information and tries to shake the attention of the other governments. And what unfortunately happens is Breckinridge Long and the State Department kind of buries it, says it has all the earmarks of a war rumor, which is what they use to slow walk and dismiss these things. But he also shares it with a Jewish British member of parliament who shares it with Rabbi Wise, the best known rabbi in the United States. And so all of a sudden, eventually, after a few months, the news comes out. And it's really important to understand that these channels, we're dealing with news that can't be substantiated for the time at the present moment, that you're having to go on the faith of third and fourth hand information, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's easily dismissed by anyone along that information chain that wants to decide who cares, right? Or this is going to make my job more complicated because if everybody wants to now let in more Jews, this doesn't work. And I don't think there should be more Jews coming into the United States. So it's hard, but it does get out. And I think Rigner is an important player who helps funnel this information to the world in spectacular fashion. And it does finally get out. John Paley is interesting. He's at Treasury. His boss is Henry Morgenthau, FDR's good friend, a Jew, and a neighbor in upstate New York. And Rigner, there are laws on the books that you can't spend the kind of money that people are beginning to realize has to be spent in order to save people, the remaining Jews of Europe. And so NGOs are doing this sort of operations. Varian Fry is a writer in a rescue committee.
Varian Fry, let me just say, Varian Fry wrote an important piece in the
Yes, we know. It's very important.
In December of 42, talking about all of this stuff. But he risked his own life. He strapped some money to his leg and went to Marseille. And with the vice consul there, Hiram Bingham III, bring out extraordinarily famous people like Marcel Duchamp and Wanda Landowska and Hannah Arendt and, Marc Chagall, but also hundreds of, ordinary people whose lives are as important to them as Chagall's is to him. Yeah. And it's a really, really good and heroic story. As he said, talking about his association with Bingham, that the crime of saving human lives, But anyway, so Paley realizes that in order for the United States government to act and to exert some influence, you've got to rescind some of these laws that don't allow you to spend money in enemy territory and things like that. They got to be able to freely bribe officials. They got to be able to hire forgers. They got to be able to do all of the kind of stuff of the spycraft that distracts us all the time. And so what eventually happens after great delay by the State Department and the intervention of Roosevelt and Morgenthau is the creation of the War Refugee Board, which is the single most important entity in saving human lives as the Holocaust is unfolding. Tens of thousands of lives are saved by it in southern France, but also particularly in Hungary and Romania. And when we celebrate the life of the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, he felt that he was working on an American project because American funds were going into the international community, particularly the Swiss and the Swedish legations, including Wallenberg, and they were using it to rent safe houses, to forge passports, to put the Jews, the remaining Jews of Europe, particularly in Romania and Hungary, who were being deported, and we had sort of convinced the government of Hungary to stop that, and then it got restarted. Anyway, to put them under the protection of other countries. And it is just, this is riveting stuff, and has all, people being smuggled by Varian Fry up and over the Pyrenees, forgers in Mandarin, making official looking documents, just making them up, and just, doing whatever you could in one of the most heroic efforts in the middle of this, the greatest cataclysm in human history, the Second World War, to save people, mostly Jews, from what was unfolding and what was by that time mostly over with. Most of the 6 million Jews had been killed. And so I think all these stories in their combination help to, as the writer Daniel Mendelsohn says in our film, particularize each individual that is saved, each individual that is lost, because of course 6 million becomes a number that it has zero meaning anymore. We try to use the other calculus that, there are 9 million Jews in Europe, when Hitler comes to power, and that 2 out of 3 of them will be dead by 1945. And that's 2 out of 3. That means, look at our screen here, right? Two of us are gone. 2 of us are gone. We don't make it, 2 of us. And that's the way you have to do it. And it may be with Anne Frank's story and her father desperately trying to get his family to the United States. Maybe it's just a single letter from a man who knows he's going to be killed, who writes to a friend and says, I just want the world to know that a person named David Berger lived. And there are hundreds of these letters of people just saying, I am, and I am not going to be around. And what is this? And so we felt, as we were working on this film, obviously this imperative to describe the US's failures and successes in the case of Fry and Bingham and Paley, but also to try to find some way to restore the full measure of their existence to the people that are now abstracted with the horrific phrase 6 million.
I'm so glad you mentioned Anne Frank, because I wanted to go there next. The film opens with the Franks, closes with the Franks, and then there's a lot of their story interwoven in between. Lynn, tell folks who Ava Geiringer is.
Yes, well, Ava Geiringer, her name today is Ava Schloss. She grew up in Austria in a Jewish family, and their family, like Anne Frank's family, which we're more familiar with, left and went to Amsterdam. And she came of age, she's the same age as Anne Frank, and she lived in the same neighborhood and went to the same Montessori school, and they were friends. And Anne Frank was interested in getting to know Ava's older brother, and Ava knew Anne Frank and her sister. And, they were schoolmates, and she paints a picture of what Anne Frank was like as a little girl. And, all of a sudden, this iconic person who's not completely real to us, even though we have her magnificent diary, sort of springs alive when you think about, here's a woman speaking to us today in her 90s. And Sarah Botstein, our partner on the film, did a beautiful interview with Ava in which she shares her story. And the reason why we chose to focus on Anne Frank, which you might think would be a strange choice for a story that's called The US and the Holocaust, is that we discovered while we were starting to work on the film, some letters and documents that came to light that Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, had tried assiduously to get to the United States. After they had escaped Germany and gone to Amsterdam, he could see the writing on the wall. He could see the threat getting worse and worse. And I think after Kristallnacht applied for a visa, and unfortunately, when the Germans invaded the Low Countries, the American embassy in Rotterdam or consulate was burned. And so the visas, his and 300,000 other people's visa applications, were destroyed. And before they went into hiding, he tried again. And he wrote to a friend in New York, a family that he knew that owned Macy's and was very well connected in the Roosevelt administration. So, he had good contacts in the US. They had the resources that the State Department required, which were quite difficult to get here. So, by all rights, if our system had been a bit more flexible and our State Department and our government had been more willing to give people even a temporary haven, maybe he didn't have to live here forever, but they could have escaped and they wouldn't have been a burden on anyone. If things were different here, Anne Frank and her family could have come to the United States and escaped from the Nazis. And, when we discovered that, we realized that this was a way, if we could sort of weave her story in and hear her voice when she starts writing the diary, to understand that we Americans have a connection to the story of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
So what might have been, and we're not big on counterfactual history, but in this case, it just causes us to reflect what's our connection to this story that happened over there. When I read the Diary of Anne Frank when I was a little girl, I didn't think it had anything to do with me. It was a terribly sad story about something that happened far away.
Yeah.
So, it was, and so Eva sort of helps us to sew this all together, because she and her family also went into hiding like the Franks.
Yes.
They also were deported to Auschwitz like the Franks. And they had a tragic outcome as well. And I don't want to give away too much, but obviously she survived. Her whole family did not survive.
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of an epilogue to their story and how connected she became to the Frank family. And she has helped us to really sort of knit together a very complicated narrative that ties together what's happening in the US and in Nazi-occupied Europe, and how we sort of deal with this legacy today, frankly, and how we remember what we remember, and how we should think about all this.
Most people's understanding, most Americans' school children's understanding begins with Anne Frank.
Right.
But as Lynn said, heretofore, there's been any inkling that there was any kind of American connection, but he does everything he can. As Lynn said, I mean, he's the perfect immigrant.
Yeah.
He's the guy you bring in. He's well-to-do. He's got connections. He's not going to be a burden to the state. He's not going to be taking stuff. He's got his, he's exactly the person that even this pernicious Johnson Reed Act wants if you're going to bring in somebody, and they don't come in. And it is just, it was important to us. We begin the film with this story, and it's shocking, because you're not supposed to begin a new look at the Holocaust with the kind of the most cliched, to say sort of superficial story that everybody knows.
One of the things that I came to understand better, and Sarah Botstein speaks about this so beautifully, is that the Diary of Anne Frank is not her complete story. She finished, she didn't keep writing it after the family was deported to Auschwitz. Yeah. So there's no actual representation in her work of what happened to the people who were sent to these horrendous, brutal, barbaric places. And Eva does bring us through the rest of that story. But as Deborah Lipstadt, the historian, says in our film, it's a beautiful diary, but it's not actually the story of the Holocaust. Yeah. It takes you right up to the edge, and then you have to fill in the blanks. Yeah, I mean, yourself, right?
She's saying, that she's doing the sort of geographical, the military calculus, as is her whole family. She records D-Day. They're coming. Right. They know exactly how close the British and American and Canadian forces are as they're moving through the Low Countries. It's just a matter. And the Franks are actually on the last train out of Westerbork, one of these clearing areas, the last train to Auschwitz.
Wow.
And you just, we're in so many ways, late.
Ava's testimony in the documentary is just incredible.
Yes,
I won't give away more than that. Let me finish with this question. You conclude the film with sound bites from a certain recent president, footage of a certain day in Charlottesville, Virginia, a few years ago, and January 6th. It's pretty obvious to me, and I think to people watching, what the connection is, but I'd like to hear in your own words why you made that choice.
Well, we have not been at all interested in, we always know that our films resonate in the present. Human nature remains the same. Every film we've done, however innocent, always has some modern thing that connects it to it. It's recognizable. The thing is that over the course of the 7 years, it was very clear how recognizable it was going to be. We'd also spent all the time, as Lynn and I have described, with the kind of table setting about who America was and this sort of prevalence of anti-Semitism and racism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And then as we're working on the film, we can't end at a an appropriate historical moment, we have to understand that the resurgence of these things reminds us of the fragility of the institutions. We watch Germany go like that, you know. I mean, Berlin's the center of culture in Western civilization, and then it isn't. We felt that we had to do it. We've even, I think, as important as that dismount, and it's not narrated, it's just a kind of couple minute montage of things that kind of crescendo to January 6th, 2021. But we just felt the obligation and the urgency. We were planning to bring this film out next year, but we moved it out. We wanted to become part of the conversation. Deborah Lipstadt says in our film, the time to stop a genocide is before it happens, to which I would feebly add, the time to save a democracy is before it's lost. Yeah. And we just need to start talking about these things. We are not equating right now with the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened, but we understand that there are all these things that are present. And as the writer Daniel Mendelsohn said, don't kid yourself. There is no bottom to human depravity and what human beings can do. And it becomes important for people of all political persuasions to sort of stop and begin to consider the kinds of things that are going on, to come to the aid of their country.
It's been frightening to be working on this film and being immersed in that time period while these things were happening around us. It really has been deeply unsettling, and maybe some comfort in understanding the dynamics that we've sort of understood of how polarization works, how demagoguery works, how propaganda works, how demonization of people works, how making scapegoats works then, so that we can understand what's happening around us. Because I frankly sometimes have a hard time actually making sense of what I'm seeing and hearing. And I wonder, back then we were saying whether people could really appreciate while they were in it. And it feels like, you know, that's where we are right now, right on the cusp. So hopefully this film will help anyone who cares to watch it to fill in some of these dots and to kind of look around a little bit with more awareness and more understanding of, you know, what's at stake right now.
We're going to find out over these next few years what what we've learned from the past.
Yeah, we got about 2 years and 2 months to go, and we'll know whether we survive. You know, Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it. And it seemed like through all the struggles that we've been through that wasn't really a question, but now it's a question. Now it's a question. So it makes where we are right now as perilous as any period that we've ever been in. And it'll be, you know, those 26 months will be, the next 26 months will really decide it all.
The film is The U.S. and the Holocaust, debuting this coming Sunday on PBS, coming in 3 parts. Lynn Novick and Ken Burns, fantastic conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
It's great to be with you.